Alright guys, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. In today's video, we're going to be debunking some Oriental myths presented by a YouTuber known as Myth Vision. Now, maybe a lot of you guys would be able to recognize him from the content that he does against Christians. But to be honest, even from my experience watching him, really, I only see a lot of substance coming from him when he brings the likes of great scholars onto his channel. But when he does relay the information himself, or even at times when he brings certain scholars on that are in mainstream, he seems to be highly uncharitable for the sole purpose to go against like the standard narrative of Christians, Muslims, or other religions. So, inshallah, today I got with me here Brother Leafy. He's going to be going through a lot of the scholarship that refutes this individual's pseudo scholarship, and they'll be showing that a lot of the scholarship he brings is actually outdated or misrepresented. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Okay, so without further ado, let's begin the video.
The birth of Islam stands as one of history's most consequential moments, a 7th century revelation that would transform the world forever. For nearly 1.8 million Muslims today, the traditional story is sacred. The Prophet Muhammad, an unlettered merchant from Mecca, received divine revelations through launching a pure monotheistic faith that restored Abraham's original religion. But what if this narrative developed centuries after the events it describes tells only part of the story? The past 50 years have witnessed a revolution in Islamic studies. Archaeologists digging in the Arabian sands, epigraphers deciphering ancient inscriptions, and historians sifting through non-Muslim accounts have pieced together a far more complex picture. They've discovered a 7th century world bubbling with religious ferment, where prophetic movements competed for followers, where Jewish, Christian, and Zoroastrian ideas flowed freely, and where the lines between religions remained remarkably fluid. This isn't simply an academic debate. Understanding Islam's origins means understanding the foundations of a global civilization that has shaped art, science, philosophy, and politics for 14 centuries. In this video, we'll reveal shocking truths that challenge everything you thought you knew about Islam's beginnings.
Yeah.
Bro, why is it more goofy the more I watch it, bro?
Yeah, from like the main takeaway from the first minute, I would say he's like trying to make it out like there's some revelation he's bringing to everyone that no one's seen before. But actually, a lot of what he's presenting is the standard like view. The standard view is that there are people coming after the Prophet ﷺ that claim prophethood. There was Jews in Medina, and there was Christians in Najran, and there was Zoroastrians in Persia, like that were neighboring like nations. But I don't know why he's presenting it like just some. The main point I would say is that he's presenting all these points in a conspiratory fashion when he's meant to be called Myth Vision, right? And as you're gonna see, like as we move on, and as Brother Leaf is gonna be debunking later, he's gonna be bringing the most conspiracy academic, I would just say,
just the most hardcore revisionists.
Just fables like the Petra theory and stuff like that.
I mean, look, I think the main takeaway that I got from the first minute, and this is like a key point with Orientalism, is that the Christians and Orientalism comes from this Christian context, this Judeo-Christian context, where the Christians and the Jews realize that they've been duped in terms of their history, that there's a big disconnect between who they thought their ancestors were and who they actually were. So they realized, oh, the people in my past have deceived me. So therefore, it must be the same across all histories. So they take that assumption and they try and apply it and superimpose it onto another tradition and think it's the same thing with them. That, okay, just because my history duped me, therefore the other people's history, they also duped them. And that's the assumption that you're going to see carries over to all his arguments. So again, it's like trauma bonding. Like, I don't know what to say here. Like,
supposedly original Islamic stories were adapted from older Jewish, Christian, and Persian myths, sometimes nearly word for word. We'll show you the exact parallels between Quranic passages and earlier texts that traditional accounts never mention. Uncover the forgotten story of Muhammad's rivals, other prophets who competed for followers in the 7th century Arabia. What if history had gone differently? We'll introduce you to Musaylima, whose movement nearly defeated early Islam, and Safra, the female prophetess who raised armies and challenged male religious authority. Explore ancient inscriptions proving monotheism dominated Arabia centuries before Muhammad, evidence that transforms our understanding of Islam's environment. Witness how miraculous stories surrounding Islam's founder emerged suspiciously late, often mirroring legends told about earlier religious figures. And perhaps most provocatively, we'll reveal how the distinct religion we now call Islam may have evolved gradually over a century, not in isolated Arabian deserts, but through complex interactions with the empires, beliefs, and cultures of the late antique world. This isn't just an academic debate. It's a journey that illuminates one of history's most consequential religious movements in an entirely new light. What you're about to see will forever change how you understand not just Islam, but how religions are born, evolve, and transform the world. The Arabia of the 6th and 7th centuries was not the isolated pagan wasteland often portrayed in traditional accounts. Rather, it sat at the crossroads of empires and ideas. To the northwest lay the Christian Byzantine Empire, heir to Rome and defender of Orthodox Christianity. To the northeast stood the Zoroastrian Persian Sasanian Empire, with its cosmic dualism of good versus evil. Between these superpowers, Arabia served as both buffer zone and commercial highway, a peninsula crisscrossed by trade routes carrying not just goods, but beliefs. Christianity had established deep roots in the region. The city of Najran in southern Arabia housed a significant Christian community. The Ghassanid Arabs served as Byzantine allies and were ardent Christians. In the east, the Lakhmid kingdom maintained ties with Nestorian Christians, those who emphasized Jesus' human nature over his divinity, having been declared heretical by the Byzantine Church. Judaism, too.
Yeah, but here he's just misrepresenting something here as well. Nestorianism isn't emphasizing Jesus' human nature over his divine nature. It's the idea that he has two persons, one person that's divine, one person that's human. And another point that I was wanting to tackle is just the whole idea that the Islamic sources don't account for, the Christians and Zoroastrians being
And Musayla and Sophia and all these things. I mean, this is just like,
Yeah.
I don't know if he's actually read the sources or he's just like reading some Orientalist trash. Like, the only reason he knows about Musaylama, like, which is there an inscription that talks about him and it's not present in our sources? Like, no, the only reason you know about it is because it's present in our sources. The only reason you know about the wars of Sophia and her alliances with Musaylama is because of our sources. So how are you coming here and trying to pretend like you're unraveling something when you're literally just reading our sources? Like, you're not doing any critical scholarship here, mate. Like, I don't know what's going on.
Yeah, and even later on, he's going to try to present that the Prophet ﷺ is coming in a whole climate where a bunch of people are claiming prophethood. But every example he gives are people that came after the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Musaylama and other individuals that came after as claiming prophethood came as a reaction to the Prophet ﷺ. And even some of them actually got assassinated as well. So this is a proof of prophethood for the Prophet. Yeah,
Some of them
exactly.
retracted. Like Sophia, she retracted. She became Muslim.
Exactly. So yeah, this is actually a proof for Islam as well, considering that so many of them submitted, so many of them actually got assassinated or other things happened to them. And yet with the Prophet ﷺ, he managed to prevail when the Quran said he was going to prevail.
Sahih.
Had gained a firm foothold, particularly in the oasis communities of Yathrib, later Medina, Khaybar, and Tema. Some Arab tribes had even converted entirely to Judaism. Archaeological evidence from northwestern Arabia reveals Jewish communities with synagogues dating back to the 3rd century CE. Perhaps most intriguing are the Hanifs, Arab monotheists who rejected both Christianity and Judaism while worshiping the God of Abraham. Traditional Islamic sources acknowledge these figures, like Waraka ibn Nafal, a cousin of Muhammad's first wife, Khadijah, who is said to have recognized Muhammad's prophetic calling. Contrary to the standard narrative of Muhammad bringing monotheism to polytheistic Arabs, epigraphic evidence tells a completely different story. Inscriptions from across the peninsula suggest that monotheism had already become widespread by the 3rd century CE. Dr. Ilka Lindstedt's analysis of pre-Islamic inscriptions shows a striking prevalence of monotheistic formulations centuries before Muhammad. The overwhelming evidence points to monotheism being the primary belief in Arabia from the 3rd century onward, Lindstedt writes. The inscriptions repeatedly invoke a single high God, often using the term Allah, the God, which would later become Allah in Islamic usage. What these inscriptions reveal is not a sharp break between paganism and Islam, but rather a gradual evolution where Arabia's religious identity was already shifting toward monotheism long before Muhammad's birth.
Yeah, I mean, this is very stupid. So, first of all, how many inscriptions do you have to make this claim? You're generalizing on a limited number of them. So, like, how many inscriptions do you have? Second of all, what do the inscriptions actually say? They just say, like, Allah, the Most High. Yeah, we know that the pagans believed in Allah, the Most High. They were henotheists. They believed that there's one high God, and they believed that he had daughters or intermediaries that they would seek closeness to him through. So how is that in any way contradictory to the Islamic narrative? That doesn't make any sense. And then finally, for him to, just the framing of it is completely off. Like, the epigraphic evidence reveals something that's incongruent with the picture we get from Islam. That's just not true.
The Quran itself talks about how they did believe in Allah as like the ultimate deity, right? So having inscriptions of that isn't a big deal. What would be a bigger deal is to see pure monotheism, because one example I could give is Christians early on that did believe Jesus was God. Some prayers you might find, they'll just be claiming that the Father is God. Like, for example, the Lord's Prayer that's found in the Gospel of Matthew. If the Christians prayed using the Lord's Prayer and praying to the Father alone, would that be then evidence to say that none of them believed Jesus was God? No, because there's other evidence you can find that they also prayed to Jesus, just not in the Lord's Prayer specifically, which obviously that's like paganism, right? You're praying to two distinct gods, two distinct deities.
I mean, also, if you just look at the pre-Islamic poetry, it itself is filled with henotheism and paganism. So you have people taking oaths by Lat and by Uzza and by all these different things. I mean, if you just read the Mu'allaqat, this is what you get. And these poems are from the Hijaz, in exactly the zone that the Prophet came from. And then also, I mean, in terms of non-Muslim testimony as well, we have other people before Islam who also talk about the different gods that were worshipped in Arabia. The sources mentioned, but let me find it one sec. Yeah, for example, the Syriac life of Sergius has the Ghassanid Philak swearing by Lat and Uzza and all the gods of the Arabs. So, I mean, like, there's many examples of this. So much so that Michael Lecker says, after surveying early Islamic and Jewish materials, he concludes that, quote, idolatry was perhaps in retreat in other places, but in Arabia it showed no signs of weakening. It formed a major obstacle for Muhammad, both in Medina and in Mecca.
Modern historians, however, applying critical methods to the earliest available evidence, paint a substantial. Several key problems complicate the traditional account. First, the earliest detailed biographies of Muhammad by Ibn Ishaq and others were written 100 to 200 years after his death, roughly equivalent to someone today writing the first detailed account of the American Revolution without prior sourcing.
I mean, just generally in Western history, you have the kind of leeway that we're talking about is that, for example, after the manuscripts we have, for example, for the life of Tacitus or Julius Caesar, centuries after the fact, if not like 700 years to 500 years after the fact, yet they're taken as historical. So, I mean, this is like the standard that Western historians use. All of a sudden, when it comes to Islam, a 100-year gap is like a big thing. Now, let's look at this 100-year gap. First of all, this is not actually true. So the traditions, it's true, Ibn Isham or Ibn the Sirah was written about 100 years after the fact, but the sources that he uses predate him, and we can actually reconstruct those sources well into the 7th century. For example, we know that even a lot of modern historians, like for example Motsky and others, and Greg Schuller, for example, would use the Urwa traditions from Ibn Isham, and they know that those traditions, through Isnad Kun Madan analysis, can actually date back to the 7th century. So we can reconstruct what he was saying as part of the biography of the Prophet and take that as authentic. And this is from the Western historians who are already revisionist and are very critical towards Islam. Now, for us, we don't need to, and these are people who consider like most hadith to be inauthentic a priori. So for us, we don't have those assumptions. So why would we, when you say, oh, no, we don't have any sources, the correct nomenclature would actually be, we don't have any extant sources, but we do have sources from the 1st century. It's just that they didn't survive. Or if they did, we can only reconstruct part of them. So this is a very like pathetic argument to try and undermine the religion. Basically, they say this just to try and give space for their revisionist reconstruction, to say, oh, there's this gap, we don't know what happened here, so I can fill it in with whatever I want. That's basically the kind of gist of it.
Second, almost no contemporary non-Muslim accounts describe Muhammad's career in Mecca and Medina. Third,
just like an argument from silence, like the burden is on him to prove that we would expect evidence of this. One, a lot of sources don't survive from that time period. Two, not many people at that time period are literate. Three, not many non-Muslims would feel the need to discuss in detail like the Prophet ﷺ or the Muslims. And even then, it's not like we have zero evidence. Like he literally mentioned Sabayos, right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, if you just read, like, for example, Seeing Islam as Others Saw It by Hoyland, who's a well-respected scholar, he basically goes through all the different non-Islamic sources and does a survey of them. And at the end of it, by the end of it, he basically just says, look, what these non-Muslim sources are saying is not that different from what the Arab sources are saying. Muhammad's basic legal prohibitions, they're all mentioned. For example, in Sabayos, he writes that he legislated for them not to eat carrion, not to drink wine, not to speak falsely, and not to commit fornication. These are all present in Islamic sources. The first mosque, which later turned to Masjid al-Aqsa, this is also mentioned in non-Muslim sources. For example, the treaties and wars between Muawiyah and Ali, these are also mentioned. The direction of prayer is also mentioned. So we have key details that are all mentioned and corroborated by non-Islamic sources. So for him to say, like, you know, there's barely anything that we know about the life of Muhammad, that's not true. We actually know a great deal from non-Muslim sources about an Arabian prophet. Like, for example, if you just read John of Damascus, you're going to get a very good feel for who the prophet is. You'll get the general idea of who he is. And that's not in any way dissimilar from what the Muslim narrative says.
Archaeological evidence from 7th century Arabia is sparse, particularly from Mecca itself. Revisionist scholars.
Well, he just refuted himself right there. He just said the evidence from 7th century Arabia is sparse, and then you're saying we need non-Muslim sources about the climate of 7th century Arabia at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Like, is this guy serious?
Yeah, that's pretty embarrassing, bro.
Scholars like John Wensbrough, Patricia Crone, and Michael Cook have used this evidentiary gap to propose alternative theories about Islam's emergence. Some of their claims are extreme.
Yeah, see, what did I tell you?
Among the most compelling revisions is what historians...
Yeah, but the thing is, like, remember at the beginning of the video, he's like, we're going to be giving you academic sources. We're going to unveil this whole idea about Islam. We're going to give you the true account.
You'll detail that these scholars are hiding from you, like this mass conspiracy. We're gonna unravel it, and he's just basically
Yeah.
regurgitating like revisionist nonsense.
And he admits himself, but he admits himself that some of these are extreme. And if you're going to see, like, for a good maybe 15, 20 minutes left of this video that we're going to see, he's literally using these extreme theories. So, like, and every time, every time he uses it, he always caveats with, it's controversial, it's disputed, but here you go, type of thing.
Yeah, basically he's just regurgitating conjecture, and a lot of it, pretty much I'd say 60% of the things like he mentions, if not like more, have been debunked already, and it's completely outdated, but he'll still mention it anyway, which is actually like very dishonest. So I mean, like, I'll read the conclusion of Hoyland's book, and even their own scholars like mention this. He says, quote, because there are so many instances of agreement, discrepancies deserve our attention. Non-Muslims authors can sometimes tell us what Muslims were saying long before this was written down by the Muslims themselves. He's saying that generally there is agreement, and discrepancies are the exception, not the rule. So generally the Muslim narrative is already confirmed, but there are some like minor discrepancies, whatever, and that's normal with any historical account. So for you to sit there and be like, this is a reason, or this 100-year gap is a reason for me to reconstruct my own history, I mean, this is dishonest. But again, what do you expect?
Yeah, and the funny thing is, he's going to be bringing up the Petra theory as well. And the funniest thing that I found throughout, looking through his channel, is the fact that Sean Anthony, another Orientalist scholar, literally mentions in the interview that this person conducted with him, Sean Anthony says that this Petra theory is rubbish, like it's complete like garbage, and yet he still goes ahead and puts it in this video about Islam's origins. Like, are you serious? Like, how more disingenuous can you get?
Fred Donner calls the Believers Movement thesis. Donner argues that Muhammad's followers initially saw themselves not as members of a new religion called Islam, but as a community of believers, mu'minun, devoted to strict monotheism. The early community was ecumenical, Donner writes, open to Jews and Christians who affirmed one God and lived righteously.
Yeah, I mean, so this Fred Donner Believers movement has been criticized by other scholars as well. Fred Donner, to basically make this argument work, what he does is cherry pick evidence. So anytime there's a hadith or evidence where non-Muslims are recording Muslims attacking Christians and Jews, or taking down crosses, or making churches into mosques, he'll discard that as a later Abbasid fabrication, a Marwanid era fabrication. But if there's any hadith or athar or verse that talks about, be good to the people of the book, speaks positively towards them, he'll be like, this supports my idea that the early Muslims at first considered the Christians and Jews part of their group, which is not true, just because they had a contract with them. And this mainly stems from the Constitution of Medina, which is something that most historians or most revisionists even consider to be authentic. And the reason why is because they use the criterion of dissimilarity, and they say, well, the Constitution of Medina, as recorded by the Sirah of Ibn Hisham, calls the Jews and the Christians believers. Therefore, this shows that there's a development in doctrine, whereas the later Muslims wouldn't consider them believers. And this is like very poor argumentation for multiple reasons. And in fact, Patricia Crone, who's like the most crazy revisionist out of all of them, she refutes this herself. She says, even this, I'm not even, like, most people say that this is like authentic. I don't even buy that, to be honest. She says this herself. So like, the main takeaway I want you guys to understand is that these people are not consistent at all. They're happy to use something when it benefits their preconceived narrative, but when it goes against the preconceived narrative, they're happy to throw it away. So again, it's just picking and choosing.
Just Jews and Christians by this term in Quran 3:199. Only gradually toward the late 7th century did a distinct Muslim identity crystallized, evidenced by the shift in language on coins and inscriptions. Another
says only in the late 7th century did a distinct Islamic identity arise. Okay, so what about the verse in the Quran? اليوم أكملت لكم دينكم وأتممت عليكم نعمتي ورضيت لكم الإسلام دينا. Today I have completed my favor upon you, and I've chosen for you Islam as your religion. When was that verse revealed? All scholars, for example, Nicholas Sinai says that we can be very, very certain that the text was crystallized in 632 and then later recrystallized in 650, and there's no reason to doubt the traditional narrative. So if you're telling me that later in the late 7th century, that's when actually the distinct Muslim identity began to arise, how do you explain away that verse? I'm just curious. Indeed, there are some among the people of the book who truly believe in Allah and what has been revealed to you, believers.
What has been revealed to you, yeah. It's saying what has been revealed to you.
So then they're Muslims. They humble themselves before Allah, never trading Allah's revelations for a fleeting end.
On coins and inscriptions. Another significant revision concerns geography. Many scholars of agriculture, fields of grain, evidenced by the shift in language on coins and inscriptions. Another significant revision concerns geography. Many scholars question whether Mecca was truly Islam's birthplace. The Quran's description of agriculture, fields of grain, vineyards, olive trees.
Wait, he's lying here though, right? Because not many scholars reject this, do they?
No. There are some scholars who try and say like it's based on a mistranslation of a hadith, bro. Basically, where they try and remember we went through this before when we were looking at the Petra video, where they were trying to say like the description of the plants in the Hijaz is not the same as it would have been then. Therefore, like we know like it's fabricated.
I understand, but like we're not going to respond to this. I'll just link the video for our refutation of this. But my question is because he said many scholars they doubt that Mecca was the birthplace of Islam.
Yeah,
that...
he's talking about the Petra stuff.
Yeah, but many scholars today believe that.
No, he's lying.
He's lying. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, I thought this was outdated.
Most scholars call the Petra stuff nonsense. Like Angelica Neweth calls it nonsense. Like no one takes this seriously.
The most they'll say is that maybe the Islamic sources exaggerate the significance.
Yeah, so like what a fair scholar would say, like for example, someone like Nicholas Sinai, they would consider themselves like a neo-traditionalist, and what they would say is something like the outline or the continental skeleton of the Islamic sources is generally reliable, but the details of it are not reliable. I can't take them at face value because you know they have supernatural claims and prophecies and etc., and that's problematic from a historical critical method perspective. So for that reason, he's literally a priori he can't take that. So, but he can, as far as he can confirm, the Islamic sources are accurate.
Don't match Mecca's barren environment. Historian researcher Dan Gibson's controversial Petra hypothesis suggests early Islam centered further north, closer to Jewish and Christian influences.
It's amazing. What are your thoughts about the Petra theory?
I think it's totally nonsense. I think it's absolutely this garbage. So you know, Petra was pretty well integrated into the world of late antiquity, into Christian world, had like bishoprics in the sea and things like this. Like we have papyri from Petra and stuff like that. There's a lot of archaeological work that's done on the Nabatean kingdom, and there's to me it's just totally without basis.
Total bunk.
Seriously, yeah.
Okay, yeah, and I ask an expert. This is what I loved.
While this specific theory remains contentious, it highlights the scarcity of archaeological evidence for Mecca's prominence in the early 7th century. Perhaps most intriguing is the theory that Islam emerged within rather than against the Judeo-Christian tradition.
By the way, guys, the Petra theory is that Mecca isn't the birthplace of Islam, rather it's all the way in Jordan.
Yeah, and the evidence for this supposedly is that the earliest mosques don't point towards Mecca. Instead, they point towards Petra. So therefore, the Muslims will actually come back. It doesn't bring it up, but the thing is that with his like claims, he doesn't actually bring up the evidences or the sources. He just kind of vaguely mentions them and then just skips past them, and he doesn't actually tell you the evidence for them. So if you're listening to this for the first time, you'll get the impression, wow, there must be some really, really good evidence for what he's saying. But if you actually look into it, it's all nonsense, it's all fluff that's been refuted. And then also on this issue of Islam coming from Judaism, this is again outdated scholarship from Patricia Crone and Michael Cook. So in their book Hagerism, they mention this, and I'll just read you like the beginning part of the book Hagerism. So the first chapter is Judeo-Hagerism, and she starts off by saying, quote, virtually all accounts of the early development of Islam take it as axiomatic that it is possible to elicit at least the outlines of the process from the Islamic sources. So here what she's saying is that most scholars are what I call neo-traditionalists, like Nicholas Sinai, for example, who would say that the sources generally of Islam, we can take them as reliable, but not completely at face value. So there might be some embellishments or, contradictions in secondary or tertiary details, but generally they're reliable. She says, quote, it is, however, well known that these sources are not demonstrably early. There is no hard evidence for the existence of the Quran in any form before the last decade of the 7th century. And the tradition which places this rather opaque revelation in its historical context is not attested before the middle of the 8th century, right? The historicity of the Islamic tradition is thus to some degree problematic. While there are no cogent internal grounds for rejecting it, there are equally no cogent external reasons for accepting it, right? And then she goes on to argue that because of this dichotomy, she's justified in basically disregarding all the entire Muslim sources and doing her revisionist reconstruction, right? And this is the basically beginning of the revisionist renaissance into 1970s. So as you can see, the outline for why she cites she needs this revisionism is that she doesn't have any evidence for the Quran. She says it's not attested in any form before the last decade of the 7th century, and the actual complete version is only in the middle of the 8th. So she's saying, look, there's basically the same thing this guy's saying. Look, there's so much time between it. How do we know nothing changed, right? So we need to be more skeptical towards the Muslim sources. Again, this is before the discovery of the Topkapi and Birmingham manuscript. So all of this is outdated scholarship. No one believes this anymore. Yet they still want to hold on to these revisionist assumptions and presuppositions. If they were honest, they would go back to the beginning and say, look, we tried revisionism. It clearly failed. We should go back to being neo-traditionalists and understand that the outline of the sources is generally reliable. The Muslim sources do attest for these things. So again, this is where he's getting his ideas from, but he doesn't actually tell you the information or why, what evidences they use. So that's why he's being dishonest.
Some scholars argue that the Quran's audience, the polytheist or mushrikun, it condemns, were not idol worshippers, but rather heterodox Christians who associated partners with God through the doctrine of the Trinity. The Quran's intense focus on rejecting divine sonship or partnership suggests an intra-monotheistic debate. In their groundbreaking work, Hagarism, Patricia Crone and Michael Cook proposed that the earliest Muslims initially aligned with Jews in a Hagarine alliance, venerating the biblical patriarchs. According to this theory, Islam began as a messianic reformist sect within Abrahamic tradition, only later developing its distinct identity. Early non-Muslim sources lend some credence to this view. They often call the Arab conquerors Hagarines, children of Hagar, or Ishmaelites, and describe them observing Jewish-like practices. The earliest archaeology of Islam.
Are you shocked that the Muslims observe Jewish-like practices, therefore they were Jews? I mean, look, it's very easy to explain away the non-Muslim sources. So let's take it at face value, right? Let's say a Christian sees a person who observes Torah's the laws of the Torah, for example. Right, and they don't drink, etc., and they're circumcised and whatever, right? So naturally, he would think, oh, this guy is a part of a Jewish religion, or he's a Jewish sect. It's easy to have that confusion. You can't then say, oh, therefore Islam began as an outgrowth of Judaism, even though that's what you'd like to say. The issue here is that the scholars themselves, they need to find some type of development. It's kind of built into the historical critical method that everything is constantly developing, right? So Islam is no exception. Islam also must have developed. So orthodoxy was not there from the beginning. Instead, what you had is these like proto-Muslims, or you can say proto-Hagareans, whatever they want to call them, and it slowly developed over time. But I mean, the much simpler response is simply that the Christians are confused because they're seeing these Arabs suddenly performing these Jewish-like practices. So naturally, they would associate them with the only thing they know, which is Judaism.
And another thing is that, like, as we know, there's bias and there's limitations behind a non-Muslim source because they might misinterpret something or they might misrepresent something because of their lack of understanding, right? So
yeah, I mean, this is very common. Yeah, I mean, this is very common. I mean, to give like one very crude example, like John of Damascus, when he talks about the Quran, he says that there's a whole chapter called the chapter of the camel, and he goes on to talk about it. A lot of these sources are very polemical, so historians have to sift through the stuff that is polemical and try and figure out, okay, what is historic that I can actually use as evidence, and how much does that weigh epistemologically in the face of all the other evidence. So the issue with revisionists is that they give way too much credence to non-Muslim sources at expense of the traditional Muslim sources. And this is why Crone and Cook and others have themselves retracted their positions multiple times when new evidence comes to light because of their reliance, or should I say over-reliance, on negative arguments from silence, and the appeal to non-Muslim sources, taking them at face value when they really shouldn't.
In Jerusalem, built in 691 CE, contains the first known inscriptions of Islamic Shahada. It's a declaration of faith, and verses denying Christ's divinity. This suggests that by the time 60 years after Muhammad's death, Islamic identity was crystallizing in opposition to Christianity. Likewise, coins minted by the early caliphate initially imitated Byzantine and Persian designs, sometimes even depicting the cross or Zoroastrian fire altars, before gradually adopting distinctly Islamic symbolism. This pattern supports the idea that Islam, as a unique religious civilization, consolidated gradually, turning an Arab empire into an Islamic empire over decades rather than emerging fully formed. The Quran stands as Islam's...
When we were actually watching this, I told you straight away, I was like, because I'm not too familiar with some of these arguments that they bring. But this one, it was my first time hearing it, and I literally told you when we were watching this video that, like, it would be natural to just assume that it's not because of a shift of tolerance towards another religion, but rather like a strategy to help assimilate people that are non-Muslim into the faith by not removing all of their culture and all of their symbols that are associated with shirk or opposing religions. Like, that's just natural.
Yeah, I mean, also just the practicality of it. The Sahaba are not like unpractical people. So what benefit do they have from when they think about it? They just barely finished the Ridda Wars. They barely just got the Arabian Peninsula back under control. Now they're opening up two new fronts against the Romans and the Persians, the two greatest superpowers who've been around for over 1,000 years. They're by no means certain that they're going to win. What benefit does it have for them to put manpower and resources to try and change coins when that process is going to take decades and decades to fully materialize? Instead, what they did is the more practical thing, which is just to say, hey, look, before we need to first consolidate power because that's awla, that's more more important for the safety of the believers and the non-believers. Then once we have power, once we have saytara, then we can think about, okay, removing the shirki symbols and focus on actually implementing all the laws as much as we can. And this is natural, it's normal. So to use this as some type of evidence that the Sahaba were like okay with shirki symbols just because they didn't immediately get rid of them, this is, and say this is like a development in doctrine or something, this is completely nonsensical and completely unjustified. Also, by the way, a source that I just pulled up, Seeing Islam as Others Saw It by Hoyland, what he says is, quote, is actually very interesting. He says, but endeavors to strip off the classical veneer and reveal the formative undercoat have often been somewhat cavalier and conjectural. So he's talking about the Islamic world. He's saying attempts to kind of take away the Islamic sources and try to find out what's beneath them have been, he says, quote, somewhat cavalier and conjectural. And then in the footnotes, he puts Hagerism and Wansborough and Patricia Clarence. So he kind of just, puts a light jab on it. He says, quote, Cronin, Cook, Hagerism are too willing to accept the non-Muslim sources at face value. This is literally what he says. And then he mentions some other scholars, and he also talks about how their positions are equally like problematic, etc., etc. So this revisionist nonsense is not very strong or appealing, like by any imagination, bro.
It's a miracle. A text Muslims believe was revealed word for word to Muhammad. The traditional accounts state that the Quran was collected shortly after Muhammad's death and standardized under Caliph Uthman around 650. Modern scholarship both supports and complicates this picture. The remarkable consistency of early Quranic manuscripts, like the famous Birmingham fragments, radiocarbon dated to the late 6th or even early 7th century, suggests the text stabilized relatively early. This contradicts those extreme revisionist claims that the Quran was fabricated much, much later. However, evidence also indicates
that's ironic, though.
You mean the ones you were just peddling? The ones that you were just peddling? The ones you just quoted, bro? Those are extreme revisionists. SubhanAllah.
Underwent editing and interpretation during compilation. The Quran is arranged thematically, not chronologically, with later Islamic scholars themselves noting verses that appear to have been abrogated or recontextualized between the Meccan and Medinan periods. When the Quran's content closely, its engagement with earlier traditions becomes unmistakable. Far from appearing in a vacuum, many Quranic passages presuppose their audience's familiarity with biblical stories. They often don't narrate these tales from scratch, but allude to them midstream as though commenting on known material. One of the most striking theories comes from the scholar Christoph Luxemburg.
Wait, pause here. Before we get to the Luxemburg nonsense, why is it the way he's presenting this evidence is like so mysterious and like he's thinking about it really hard and he's like this scholar, like, bro, what are you doing, bro? Like, subhanallah, like he's literally just saying the most like, basic observation. Wow, the Quran presupposes an understanding of biblical text. Is that really that deep? Yeah, you have to hit this pose and start thinking that difficult. I don't know, man.
Yeah. Imagine if the Quran engaged with material that wasn't existent to the Romans, that isn't existent to apocryphal texts or biblical texts or Jewish commentaries. If it wasn't engaging with stuff that's present as its main theme, then it just wouldn't be something that would attract Christians or Jews to engage with it. They're just thinking that, oh, what's it? If the Quran only brought up details that aren't actually assumed or known at the time, such as the story of the Exodus and the story of Moses and the story of all these other prophets, Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, etc., peace be upon them all. If the Quran just presented details of other traditions that aren't known or other details that aren't known, then it just wouldn't even seem like an Abrahamic religion. The whole point is that the Quran is a continuation, something that's fulfilling past scriptures and the true parts that exist in there. And the Prophet ﷺ is a continuation of these past scriptures. And that's one of the main themes in the Quran. So obviously it's going to be engaging with biblical and other materials.
Yeah, I mean, also on the point of the Quranic compilation, like he makes that point earlier, where he says like we don't know what type of redactions happened earlier, and like part of it is confirmed and part of it isn't. I mean, I'll just read like Nicholas Sinai. He says one must admit that the argument at the end of the preceding section is not assailable, meaning the argument that there was someone after 650 who standardized the Quran or changed the Quran, like Al-Hajjaj or what's his name, Abdul Malik or Mujahid or anyone else for that matter. He says. He brings examples of verses that would have been corrected, and if such a standardization took place and they weren't. So he uses that as evidence to say that the traditional narrative is faithful. He says, secondly, if it is conceded that most Quranic corpus must have been extant before Al-Hajjaj and that the latter did not correct existing portions of the text, does this rule out the insertion of new material? In other words, can we rule out that the Quran might have constituted a literary corpus which was textually stable yet could still be added to? Such objections obviously raise a burden of proof dilemma. Should we require proponents of the conventional view that the standard rasm of the Quran had become fixed by 650 to produce conclusive proof of the evidence of later traditions, or should we instead require scholars insisting on the possibility of later additions to prove that such additions do in fact exist? He says, I would submit that the latter position is more reasonable. Right. So what he's saying is, look, if someone wants to come and claim that Abd al-Malik or al-Hajjaj or anyone else for that matter came and changed the Quran or added something that was not in the Uthmanic recension, the Uthmanic Rasm, then they have to produce evidence of this. And until they do so, the most reasonable position is to take the position of the traditionalists, which is the position that he ascribes himself to. So he says, from this we can gather that the most reasonable position, and his position is, the text was stabilized by 650, and this is in line with the traditional narrative. Also here, Akhi, if you want, because he's going to bring up the Sana palimpsest, you can play the video by Dr. Joseph Lombard, like in response to this, but when he brings it up.
Who proposes that many obscure Quranic passages make sense when read as Syro-Aramaic rather than pure Arabic. According to the controversial Luxembourg thesis, parts of the Quran derive from Syriac Christian liturgical texts, written in an Arabic dialect heavily influenced by Syriac vocabulary. Luxembourg's most famous example concerns the Houris, promised to the righteous in paradise, traditionally translated as dark-eyed virgins. He argues the word hur in Quran 56:22 actually refers to white grapes, a symbol of heavenly bliss in Syrian Christian hymns. While this particular claim remains highly disputed, linguistic analysis does confirm that numerous Quranic terms, like Sirat, I believe that's how
The original written language of the Quran, but Karshuni?
Karshuni. This comes down to the idea that from Christoph Luxemburg, that the Quran was written in a mixed Syro-Arabic language with lots of Syriac, and it's nonsense. It's total pseudo scholarship, and the Quran is absolutely written in Arabic.
we pronounce it, or Furqan, I'm probably butchering these, Criterion, and Injil, the Gospel, are loan words from Aramaic. Then there's the discovery of the sign.
Yeah, I mean, come on, bro. So again, this is just like throwing mud on the wall and trying to see what sticks. Like this is not like uncovering the origins of early Islam. It's more like going through the history of all the revisionists' theories and why they're all like dumb. Like that's basically what it is. It's like a biggest compilation of all the bad revisionist theories on the origins.
But you know, Leafy, he admits himself whenever he mentions these theories, he's just like, it's controversial, it's disputed, but then he just still goes on to mention them. Like,
yeah,
he should retitle the video, not the forbidden truth about Islam's origins, like as you said, the terrible scholarship that's gotten into disputing the Islamic narrative that have failed miserably, literally.
No, it should be like 10 reasons why I'm not a revisionist. Like, and each reason should be like one of the theories that failed, like that they previously had a consensus on. So I mean, like with this Luxembourg things, I'll just read a quote from Dr. Joseph Lombard, who's a Islamic scholar. He says, quote, "More recently, Christopher Luxembourg has provided a more audacious reading of the Islamic textual history, one which requires that the foundations of the Arabic language itself were not known to the Arabs, but only discovered by Luxembourg with help from his team in the late 20th century. Luxembourg's reading leads him to declare that the entire scholarly Muslim edifice is thus unsubstantiated." So this is what he says. He goes on to say that the theory demands that the exclusion and reconfiguration of large swaths of historical data in order to fit a preconceived narrative, and to ignore basic principles of paleography, linguistics, and histography. Each of these works exhibits an extreme example of the prevailing tendency in Euro-American scholarship to declare interpretive frameworks that arise within the Islamic tradition invalid in order to aggregate to authors of the Euro-American tradition with the main, ability to have knowledge production, basically. So that's just one scholar, but pretty much every other scholar also like takes the same position.
Palimpsest in Yemen, Quranic parchments with variant verses beneath a later rewritten text, provides physical evidence that the text was not absolutely fixed in the first decades. The differences are mostly minor phrasing changes or verse order swaps, but they indicate some degree of revision occurred. This textual fluidity aligns with the revisionist suggestion that early caliphs or scholars standardized the Quran.
So first of all, I just want to say, like, this whole like nonsense that he's bringing up, I just want you guys to notice that he keeps doing the same thing. He just keeps bringing up like a shubha, like a doubt. He rarely ever goes into the actual evidence for why that thing is the way it is, or the way his narrative is true, and he just says, "Oh, this supports the revisionist narrative." But what he actually said doesn't support the revisionist narrative. The traditional narrative itself says that there are variations in text in the Quran. We ourselves are testifying for this. The Muslims themselves testify to this. The variations, you wouldn't know about them without us. For 1,400 years, if we told you the Quran was perfect without a letter and a dot, no one would say anything. The Christians would have no idea. right? We the Muslims were honest in their tradition, and we testified that there were variations, that there were different modes of recitation, and that all of these ultimately go back to the Prophet, peace be upon him, and they're all fine, and they're all part of wahy, they're all part of revelation. So for him to be like, oh, this is supporting the revisionist narrative, is completely untrue. How does that support the revisionist narrative?
For all of the criticisms that there have been of the Quran and all the speculations there have been regarding the compilation of the Quran within Western scholarship, some would say that the Quran actually began earlier than the Muslims say it began, or some would say that the whole history of it actually went another 200 years after the time of the Prophet Muhammad. None of those are actually grounded in studies of the available manuscripts. As more and more manuscripts have become available, we've been able to confirm with greater and greater accuracy, scientifically, as empirically as one can, that the story that the Muslims have of the compilation of the Quran is, for the most part, accurate. As Carl Ernst has said, it is a better explanation of the data that we have available to us than any other theory that anyone has proposed. The most recent manuscript that was found, and the earliest manuscript of the Quran ever to be found, are the ones that were found in Sana'a, in Yemen, in the old mosque in Sana'a. And there was a lot of speculation when those manuscripts were first found. In fact, there was an article in the Atlantic Monthly about how this was going to tell us new things about the history of the Quran. Well, nobody had studied them at that point. This was just speculation. Now they've been studied, not all of them, but at least one folio has undergone rigorous analysis. And that rigorous analysis has demonstrated through carbon dating, one, that manuscript does come at about the time when Muslims say the Quran was compiled. But then there's even an underscript of the Quran that's shown, that's on the parchment. What happens is, in the old days, when you used parchment, if you wanted to write something new on it, you didn't throw out the parchment because it was so expensive. You would erase what was on there, and then you would write something new. Now, the inks were also partially metal-based. So through infrared photography, we can actually get an image of what that Arabic script was that was on that parchment before the Quran as we know it was written on that parchment. That infrared photography has shown us that the surahs as we know them were there and intact. Furthermore, they even show that the slight variations that are in the text are ones that Muslims have attested. There wasn't anything that one could call a variant that Muslims had not attested was a variant of the Quran that had been transmitted by some Muslims. Now, the other thing is, if you think about it, if somebody were to make up a history of the text, you wouldn't have made it up the way that Muslims have the history written down. You would have said, well, it was written at this time, and then it was put down under the time of the Prophet Muhammad, and alhamdulillah, that was that. You wouldn't say, well, first, after he died, they didn't have it written down. Then under the Caliphate of Abu Bakr, it was written in one form, and then a few years later, around the year 650, it was put down in another compilation, and this was the final compilation. Nobody would make up that story. So even there, it is really an act of distrust on the part of the Orientalists to try to find different histories, A, than what the Muslims first accounted for, and B, what the manuscripts actually tell us.
That's pretty comprehensive from Dr. Lombard. And I'll quote another scholar here, Sanyani. And what they say is, after doing the most rigorous stylometric analysis on the Quran, they say, quote, the amount of work yet to be done is great, and the main paths of embarking on the tasks are clear. It is now equally clear that recent works in the genre of historical fiction are of no help. By historical fiction, I'm referring to the works of authors who contently ensconced next to the mountain of material in the pre-modern Muslim primary and secondary literature bearing on Islamic origins, saying that there are no heights to scale, nothing to learn from the literature, and who speak of the paucity of evidence, so the lack of evidence, basically. Liberated from the requirement to analyze the literature critically, they can dream up imaginative historical narratives rooted in meager cherry picking or irrelevant evidence, or in some cases, no evidence at all. They write off the mountain as the illusionary product of religious dogma or of empire-wide conspiracies or of mass amnesia or deception, not realizing that the literary sources need not always be taken at face value to prove a point, or they simply pass over the massive evidence in silence. So, I mean, that quote itself is very telling on the state of academics. Now, in terms of the Luxembourg hypothesis, another scholar, Saleh, he says, the method of the Luxembourg hypothesis is so idiosyncratic, so inconsistent, that it's simply impossible to keep this line of argument straight. Again, and Angelica Newworth also says Luxembourg's assumptions lacks a methodologically sound basis. This is what she says as well in the Cambridge Companion to the Quran. So all of these go to show the dishonesty of revisionists and how really weak and feeble their position stands. And when you think about it, it's really no wonder that they have to go to such extremes, because when you have the evidence in your face, you really have to kind of be a hyper skeptic to kind of fixate on small points of disagreement and then kind of make that into something bigger than it is, or to try and come up with these really, really crazy conspiracy theories. That's why for me, it's always fun listening to these guys talk, because you're never going to know what nonsense is going to come out of their mouth next. SubhanAllah.
In 685 to 705 CE, whose reign saw the first widespread appearance of distinctly Quranic phrases on coins and inscriptions.
Yeah, I mean, this just goes back to what I said before. Like, if anyone changed the Quran after Uthman, first of all, Nicholas Sinai himself, he says that there was a textual shock freezing in the continental text of the Quran after 650 due to the manuscript evidence, which itself shows that if this is, he says, best attested to as a reaction to the death of a charismatic leader who himself was the sole authority to edit the text. So people after, they were so scared to change the text, they didn't change Mecca to Becca. That's how scared they were to change the text. That's how sacred they revered it. And Nicholas Sinai makes the point that, look, if these changes, which are so insignificant, Mecca to Becca, it's the same word, but you're just changing the continental skeleton to make that. Surely these changes would have been changed if Abd al-Malik was the one changing it, or if Al-Hajjaj was changing it. So again, this is all evidence against their position. He says that their position is untenable, and it's much more reasonable to accept the traditional narrative. And this is pretty much this is pretty much the majority position in mainstream scholarship. There are like revisionist schools, obviously, and this guy's the one who's cherry picking from all of them. But generally, for the most part, if you find a decent scholar, he's not going to tell you any of the stuff this guy's saying.
In the biblical tradition, frequently referencing figures like Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, David, and Solomon. Yet the specific forms these stories take often reflect not the Bible itself, but post-biblical Jewish commentaries and legends, what Muslims later term Israeliyat.
Why does he contrast the Bible with something he calls legends? Like, he should equally call them legends, but both of them, right? So like,
yeah,
why
exactly.
make the distinction? And the whole point is, yeah, like the Quran's engaging with material. It's not making this. The Quran doesn't care about the canon, what's Bible and what's not the Bible. The point is, there's written texts about history, about what supposedly would have happened, about oral tradition, and the Quran doesn't make a distinction between the two. There, like, if it's true, it's true. If it's not true, then it's going to be in conflict with the Quran, and the Quran will correct it.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, and also just another important quote that I think is relevant here to add. A quote: manuscript evidence now corroborates pre-modern reports about the existence of companion codices. They're having different surah ordings, and to an extent, the nature of the verbal differences. Conclusively refuted is John Burden's theory that all such reports were post-Uthmanic fictions aimed at countering, elucidating, or even evading the Uthmanic text. And this is from, again, Sagari. So the companion codices confirm the Islamic narrative, not the revisionist one.
This is actually an article written by a Western scholar who teaches at University of Notre Dame named Gabriel Said Reynolds. I think his family is Lebanese Christian. And I want you to think about this, right? The idea here is, when does the Quran originate? So the general, prior to this, a lot of historians who are really skeptical of Islamic history said that the Quran was a later construct that was put together in like the 700s or even 800s of the Common Era. Things like this radiocarbon dating and a lot of other early Quranic pages that have been found really put a rest to this. But now look what happens. The fact that the date is 568 to 645, Gabriel Said Reynolds writes, the upshot of all these early dates is that the Quran may very well date earlier than Uthman, perhaps much earlier. Ooh, what does that mean? It may be time to rethink the story of the Quran's origins, including the traditional date of Muhammad's career. So I want you to think about this, right? What is the Muslim claim? The Muslim claim is that the Quran comes from the time of the Prophet. So 610 to 632, and then around 650, the Caliph Uthman promulgates the official version of the Quran. So 610 to 650. That's the claim. Now, think about this. Why is that so hard to believe? You can believe that and still be an atheist. You can say this was all made up. Muhammad wrote it himself. Someone else wrote it. I don't know. You can be an atheist. You can deny its divine revelation. You can do whatever you want. But the only claim being made here is that it comes from this time period. But note, it's just, that can't be accepted. Either it has to be a lot later, or now if we get these dates, it must come from earlier. In fact, maybe it comes from before the life of the Prophet. Here's a quote from, or I wrote this in one of my articles. I just pasted it here for you to see. A number of scholars who have interest in early Islamic history, particularly the popular author Tom Holland, have stated that the carbon dating of the Birmingham Quran pages suggests that the Quran actually predates the life of Muhammad. In fact, he argues it suggests that the Quran dates from a good deal before Muhammad's career. Just think about this, right? What these people are saying is either the Quran is much later invention, or it comes from before what we think Islam's origins are, but it can't come from the time that Muslims say it comes from. Why is that unacceptable to these people. And this is why you have to understand the psychology, the mindset that comes out of the historical critical method and its origins. Orthodoxy is a later creation. So whatever the religion officially says is not the original story. It's a later creation. You discover the original story by going back, looking at early texts, using the principle of uniformitarianism, using the principle of analogy, using anachronism, right? Using principle of dissimilarity, and then you figure out what the real story is. So whatever Islam says, whatever Muslims are saying, can't be true. It can't be true because that's not how religions work. You're going to go and uncover the real origins. So what that means is there's just this refusal to accept that the Muslim narrative about the Quran's origins are true. Even though there's nothing, again, you can be an atheist, you can deny the Prophet of Muhammad, all these things. All the Muslims are saying is the Quran comes from the mid 7th century. That's it. But that's just unacceptable to some Western scholars who really are controlled and whose kind of worldview is suffused by the historical critical method and its origins. Okay, that's all I will say to you.
So basically here, what the point Jonathan Brown is making, and even though we disagree with him on many issues, but this point is correct, is that what he's saying is the Orientalists have a initial distrust of Islam. Like, remember what I said at the beginning, these people, because they were duped in their history, they're assuming that we're being duped in ours as well. They're just basically, carrying that trauma and trying to superimpose it on us, right? Which is very unsound, these historical critical scholars. Anyway, what Jonathan Brown says to Gabriel Sage Reynolds is now, because of the evidence is overwhelming that the Quran was not created after in the 8th or 9th century, as Shoemaker or Wansborough said, this consensus has now been shattered, according to Angelica Newworth. What instead he says is, perhaps the Quran is much older than we thought. So whatever the case may be, it can't be the case that the Muslims are being honest. That's basically what it is. We have to be ultra skeptical towards the Muslims. The Muslims are, what are we saying? What we're saying that, look, simply the Quran was compiled between 615 and 632 AH, and that its ultimate final recension was in 650. That's a historical claim. There's no metaphysical or anachronistic nonsense going on there. It's just a purely historical claim. And yet, even towards historical claims, they're so skeptical that even when the evidence supports our position, they're still sitting there and thinking in the back of their head, saying perhaps the Quran was actually created much earlier in the 5th or 6th century. It's kind of embarrassing, to be honest, but it just shows you the insight into how these revisionists think and the methodology that they use when approaching the material and why it's so problematic.
Stories of the Israelites. Consider the Quranic verse of Cain and Abel's story. The Bible, Genesis 4, relates how Cain killed Abel, but gives few details. The Quran 5:27-31 adds a dramatic scene after the murder. Then Allah sent a raven, scratching the ground to show him how to hide the corpse of his brother. This vignette of a bird teaching burial is absent from the Bible, but appears in Jewish Midrash Tanhuma, where two birds, one killing the other and digging a grave, inspire Cain's actions. Another famous example is the Quranic maxim, whoever kills a soul, it is as if he had slain all mankind. And whoever saves a soul, it is as if he saved all mankind. Quran 5:32. This striking phrasing directly parallels a saying in the Mishnah, Sanhedrin 4:5, a Jewish legal text compiled around the 3rd century. Whoever destroys a single life, it is as if he destroyed the whole world. And whoever saves a single life, it is as if he saved the whole world. The Quran's portrayal of Abraham contains elements absent from the Bible, but found in later Jewish legend. In Surah 21:50-7, Abraham confronts his father's idol worship, breaks the idols, and is thrown into a fire, only to be miraculously saved by God's intervention. The Bible mentions none of this, but Midrash Genesis Rabbah describes young Abraham breaking his father's idols and being cast into a fiery furnace by King Nimrod, from which God delivers him. Even the Quranic account of the golden calf during the Exodus includes the detail that the idol lowed like a cow, Quran 7:148, a feature found in rabbinic commentary imagining the calf miraculously making sounds. The Quran enters into conversation with earlier texts, selectively affirming some elements while revising others to align with its strict monotheistic message.
Like we were saying before, with the Quran, it's engaging with material that is true, not just solely found within a particular biblical text, but also outside of it. Because the Quran doesn't work in the framework of a biblical canon that came later. That's highly anachronistic to go then look back at these texts in that fashion. Even early church fathers, and I'll be putting on the screen right now, they treated apocryphal texts as having truth, but not to the same level as canon texts, which obviously is the same sort of attitude that we would have for all texts. They have some truth, while the actual wrong parts are still going to be found in there. We don't hold to this view that the canon of the Bible is going to have necessarily more truths than apocryphal texts. It's just that they're a mixture between truth and falsehood. And this whole idea of okay, these are 3rd century texts and the Quran is borrowing from it and these are legends. Well, you're gonna say the same thing about the Bible. Literally, once you prove that the Quran is the word of God, then it's then a theological claim to say the truths that are found in previous texts are true because the Quran is the word of God. We don't hold to the fact that these texts are historical, or they meet certain historical requirements of Orientalists, therefore they're historical. No, that there's a massive amount of oral tradition that goes behind this, and obviously Orientalists don't care about oral tradition. I mean, look at their perspective on hadiths. They have such a lowly view on it because they don't take oral tradition seriously. But the fact of the matter is, the Midrash and stuff in the Talmud is going to have stuff in there that is compiled in the 3rd century, even though it's mentioning stuff that happened way before. It's because Jews had this attitude of not writing down oral traditions. They didn't write down the oral traditions similar to the Pharisees at the time of Jesus, peace be upon him. They wouldn't write down these traditions, although the traditions would be found are much earlier than the 3rd century.
Complex and fascinating. Jesus, Isa, and his mother Mary, Miriam, feature prominently. Miriam has an entire chapter named after her, more recognition than she receives in the New Testament. The Quranic portrayal of Jesus aligns with the Eastern Christian perspective. He is a miracle-working prophet and Messiah, born of a virgin, but emphatically not divine. Do not say Trinity, God is only one God, admonishes Quran 4:171. This high regard for Jesus, coupled with rejection of his divinity, mirrors beliefs of certain Jewish Christian sects, like the Ebionites, who saw Jesus as a righteous prophet, not God incarnate. What's particularly striking is the Quran's use of apocryphal Christian stories absent from the canonical Gospels. The Quran describes Mary giving birth beneath a palm tree that miraculously provides dates and fresh water, Quran 19:22-26. This scene doesn't appear in the New Testament, but features in Christian apocrypha, like the Proto-Gospel of James and the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew. Similarly, the Quran has the infant Jesus speaking from the cradle to defend his mother's honor, Quran 19:29-33, and later creating birds from clay that come to life when he breathes on them, Quran 3:49 and Quran 5:110. Both miracles appear in the infancy Gospel of Thomas, but not in the canonical text of Scripture. Perhaps most theologically significant is the Quran's stance on Jesus'
Like, before we get to him talking about Jesus' crucifixion, well, the point is that how could the Prophet ﷺ have knowledge in Mecca of all of these stories, Jewish commentaries, apocryphal texts, the Bible, more than Christian commentaries,
Christian
so
church
on and so forth.
tradition, Greek
and then,
legends,
and then
Syriac legends.
later on, he's going to mention Zoroastrian tradition as well. How could the Prophet ﷺ have access to all of these sources in Mecca as being someone, one, who's illiterate, and two, someone who's living in Mecca where the Quran is telling us that these traditions aren't known to these people? So much so, they think that prophets are meant to come as angels, not as humans. So much so that the Quran says also, again and again and again, you didn't know these stories, neither you nor the people around you. A repeated claim made in the Quran. Why would the Quran be saying this if it's evidently false and you have oral traditions circulating? Not just oral traditions to the extent where you have a library's worth of sources and traditions. This is just absurd, right? It's just contradicting a fundamental aspect of what we know in Mecca from the Quran itself.
Yeah, so this was actually one of the reasons for the Wansboro hypothesis. And for those of you who don't know, this was the idea peddled by revisionists in the 1970s and 80s that basically the Quran was not made in the 7th century. It was actually made in the 8th or 9th century during the Abbasid period, because that's when we know that there was this Christian intermingling and this Zoroastrian intermingling, and these religions and cultures and traditions were all mixed together into one hodgepodge. So that's when the Quran was made. And the Quran was not made by one person, Muhammad. In fact, Muhammad doesn't even exist. It's not even real. This is all back projected to him. Really, the Quran was made by multiple different people who are all specialists, poets, linguists, and there was different types of Qurans that were later patchworked together. This is what Shoemaker says in his works. Now, this hypothesis is so absurd, but notice why they had to say this. This was the original Orientalist assumption about the Quran, because they looked at it and they said, look, how does he know all these things? We don't have any Arabic material from him. So, I mean, based off oral tradition, is it really possible like that he could get all these different stories and put them in such a way and reconstruct them in such a way with perfect narrative, intertextuality and weaving? Just read their works, like Nicholas Sinai's work on it, for example. He goes into all these different examples and he shows the intertextuality and interplay that the author is familiar with Hebrew and Aramaic and Syriac and whatever and all these things. How can one man do all these things? It's impossible. So it must be the work of multiple people. And that was the original hypothesis. So I'll just read you from Angelica Newworth what she says about this hypothesis. So she says here, quote, "The presentation of Quranic developments in this chapter presupposes the reliability of the basic data of traditional accounts about the emergence of the Quran, assuming the transmitted Quranic text to be a genuine collection of the communications of the Prophet as pronounced during his activities at Mecca and again at Medina. It is true that the earlier consensus of scholarly opinion on the origins of Islam has, since the publication of John Wansbrough's Quranic Studies and Patricia Crone and Michael Cook's Hagerism, have been shattered, and that various attempts at a new reconstruction of those origins have been put forward. As a whole, however, the theories of the so-called skeptic or revisionist scholars who arguing historically make a radical break with the transmitted picture of Islamic origins, shifting them in both time and place from the 7th to 8th or 9th century and from the Arabian Peninsula to the Fertile Crescent, have by now been discarded, though many of their critical observations remain challenging and still call for investigation. So she herself notes, and she's one of the top leading academics on Quranic studies, and she's noting that, look, this previous consensus of revisionists is completely untenable now with the manuscript evidence that we have. It's completely been shattered. And likewise, so will all the other hypotheses be shattered as well in the future, inshallah, God willing. But what I want Muslims to understand is that don't be intimidated by these Orientalists or these revisionists with their fancy theories and whatever, because their arguments really, they don't hold any weight. Most of them is just unsubstantiated assumptions or cherry picking or arguments from silence, and they're all fallacious for different reasons. So just, yeah, that's pretty much it.
They did not kill him, nor did they crucify him, but it was made to appear so to them. Quran 4, 157. This denial of the crucifixion, as many have interpreted it this way, Christianity's central event, aligns with certain Gnostic doctrines. The 2nd century Gnostic teacher, Basilides, taught that Simon of Cyrene was substituted for Jesus on the cross, while Jesus escaped. A belief echoed in apocryphal texts like the second treatise of the great Seth. These parallels suggest that the ideas reaching the Arabian Peninsula came not just from mainstream Byzantine Christianity, but from heterodox traditions circulating in Syria and Egypt. Islamic tradition itself acknowledges potential Christian influences through figures like Waraka ibn Nafal, a learned cousin of Muhammad's wife Khadija, said to have been familiar with Christian scriptures, and Bahira, a monk who allegedly recognized the young Muhammad as a future prophet. The very structure of certain Quranic passages resembles Syriac Christian hymns and homilies. The light verse, Quran 24:35, Allah is the light of the heavens and the earth, bears similarities to Syriac descriptions of God as light. While Surah 120.
Bro, are you serious? Like, bro, what a stretch. Like, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is called light.
Nur as-samawati wal ard.
And God is called light in another tradition, therefore borrowing. Like, are you serious? Like, that's so general. So he's saying, for example, right? He's saying that the Quran is borrowing from homilies because Allah is called light of the heavens and the earth. Then you have homilies discussing God being light. But it could equally be that the Quran is interacting with the Gospel of John, for example, where Jesus is called the light of the heavens and the earth. And the Quran could be potentially refuting that. And another point to add to this, to show that the Quran does do these intertext analysis of the Gospel and reshapes it, is, for example, where Jesus, peace be upon him, gives the keys of the heavens and Hades to Peter, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually responds to this in the Quran that you can see, where he says he alone obtains the keys of the heavens and the earth. So this is reshaping from a more monotheistic outlook of what it means to have the keys of the heavens and earth. It's solely for God. He solely has a sovereign of that. Or, for example, him being the light of the heavens and the earth. He is the light of the heavens and the earth, not Jesus, peace be upon him, in the Gospel of John. You can interpret it in that light rather than saying that it's being taken from homilies. And even if these parallels didn't exist, this idea of God being light is just way too general, bro. This is a reach.
Yeah, but that's like all their theories, bro. Like, this is not an exception. This is like baseline stuff for them.
12. Say, he is God, one. Reads almost like a direct response to the Nicene Creed, using similar rhythmic patterns while asserting strict monotheism. In essence, Islam's initial engagement with Christianity was selective, embracing Jesus' miracles, virgin birth, and prophethood, while firmly rejecting any hint of divine incarnation or Trinitarian theology. The Quran positions itself as restoring Jesus' true message against what it regards as later corruptions. Beyond the biblical...
And you know, this actually refutes the whole Islamic dilemma nonsense that Christians bring, because he's trying to say the Quran knows the Nicene Creed, the Quran knows this, the Quran knows that.
Who else mentions the Nicene Creed in the 7th century Hijaz? I'm just wondering.
Sphere, Persian and Mesopotamian religious concepts significantly shaped early Islam. The Arabian Peninsula had long interacted with the Persian Empire, and after the Islamic conquest of Iran in the 640 CE, many Zoroastrians became part of the emerging Muslim community. Islamic eschatology, end times doctrine, shows striking parallels with Zoroastrian beliefs. Zoroastrianism taught that souls cross a razor-thin bridge, Chinvat Bridge, over hell, face a final resurrection of bodies, and receive eternal rewards or punishments. Islam describes a similar bridge of Irat that all must cross, with the wicked falling into hellfire below. Even the Quranic imagery of
Yeah. So
Yeah, I mean, I don't see the issue with this. Like, just
Mhm.
saying, like, we believe that Zoroastrian religion was at one time Islam, like that they were sent a prophet and he came with Islam. So naturally, the prophet would have taught them about the end times, and naturally, the mentioning of the end times would be similar to what our prophets mentioned to us. So for that to be like a common link or similarity between them is in no way problematic. This doesn't necessitate borrowing. So the burden of proof is on you to show that there's borrowing. It's not enough to just say, oh, there's similarity in concept or idea, therefore that they copied from one another. This is not true or like unsubstantiated on his part.
And he's added another layer now of like the author of the Quran has to know now Zoroastrianism, and he actually linked this to the link of Zoroastrianism to the Quran is by virtue of conquest. But at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, as we know, like from all the scholarship we discussed before, the Quran was already stabilized at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, before the conquering of the Persian Empire. So he has to explain how these Zoroastrian beliefs would have made its way into Mecca.
How also do you not know that the Quranic claims are also not influencing the Zoroastrians? Because it could be the other way around as well. I mean, what evidence do we have from the Zoroastrian tradition extant before Islam that they believe these things, and which one was before the other? Because a lot of the times with these claims of copying, you'll actually find that the thing that the Quran is supposedly copying actually comes after the Quran. So it doesn't really make any sense. More likely, a lot of the time, what you'll find is that the Quran is actually influencing other religions. So for example, with Judaism, we know that once Islam began to spread, a lot of the ideas about two powers in heaven, they would go away because of the advent of Islam. So for example, Maimonides was greatly influenced by Islamic thinking and different Islamic philosophers and thinkers in Spain and Andalus. So likewise here, why do you not assume that the pollination is going the other way around? What's your evidence for it being in the direction you're asserting? You haven't given any.
Sexual purity laws concerning washing, menstruation, and impurity have rough counterparts in Zoroastrian purity codes. While such practices exist in many religions, the intensity of purity concerns in early Islam might have been reinforced by Persian attitudes.
Yeah, but they're like Jewish traditions, they have heavy considerations of purity as well. Like you even find this in the Gospels where Jesus, peace be upon him, tells the Pharisees concerning them washing their hands before eating as a ritual. Like they actually consider this a ritual. You have to wash your hands before you eat as a spiritual ritual. So this isn't like exclusive for Zoroastrianism, nor why would we give a preference of Zoroastrianism here over like Judaism, as there being continuity here.
Continues in post-Quranic Islamic tradition. The Prophet's famous night journey, Isra and Maraj, though not detailed in the Quran, bears similarities to Zoroastrian texts like the Arda Virath Nama, where a priest travels through cosmic realms guided by an angel. The Islamic version localizes this genre of celestial ascent common across the region, with Jerusalem as the stepping stone. Such cross-cultural fertilization doesn't diminish Islam's distinctiveness, but illustrates just how new religions naturally incorporate and transform elements from their environment. Persian, Mesopotamian, and Arabian cultural motifs were woven into Islam's fabric, even as it maintained its core commitment to strict monotheism and prophetic revelation. However, one of the most
But you see, this text that he used, Arda Viraf or whatever it's called, actually a lot of scholars date it after the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So yeah, like that's a very poor thing to bring up for a parallel. That's probably the only thing there as well that I would say there's a distinct parallel that's clear is the Isra and Mi'raj parallel to this Zoroastrian tradition. But the other ones, they're pretty general, like similarities. And even if we were to concede that, the Zoroastrian tradition is being confirmed by the Quran here, I mean, the Quran, there's a prominent belief that Zoroastrians would have been part of Ahlul Kitab, or that they would have had a prophet sent to them, and they would have potentially had some truth left in their tradition. So there's like no problem in believing that.
Yeah, I mean, it's just the same thing that I said before, isn't it? It's just if you think that, I mean, the best argument that they could say is like, oh, they both stem from a common tradition that, you know, goes back even earlier than both of them, and they're both just like copying it and remixing and mismatching. But what's the evidence for that? You can't just say, oh, these two things are in common, therefore like there's a common tradition. What's the evidence? There isn't any. So again, it's just like speculation, and there's really no evidence to say like, oh, they're copying this, they're copying that.
overlooked aspects of Islam's origins is that Muhammad was not the only claimant to prophethood in 7th century Arabia. The Islamic tradition itself records several contemporaries who proclaimed divine missions either during Muhammad's lifetime or shortly after his death. This proliferation of prophetic figures reveals a landscape charged with religious expectation, where charismatic leadership combined with claims of revelation was a pattern of the time. Much like how multiple messianic claimants arose in the 1st century Judea, Musaylima, nicknamed the Liar in Islamic sources, emerged from the Banu Hanifa tribe in Central Arabia. During Muhammad's lifetime, he proclaimed himself a prophet and even wrote to Muhammad suggesting they share authority. He attracted a substantial following by preaching in a poetic, Quran-like style. Islamic sources preserve fragments of his alleged revelations, verses about frogs and promises of prosperity that read as simplistic echoes of Quranic rhetoric. After Muhammad's death, Musaylima became the focus of the Ridda, apostasy wars. The first caliph, Abu Bakr, dispatched forces that defeated and killed him at the Battle of Yamama in 633 CE. The threat Musaylima posed was serious. His tribe was powerful, and until his defeat,
Yeah, mama.
Yeah,
Your mama.
mama, the battle of your mama. Like, come on, look, before you guys, do the top 10 revisionist theories that have been debunked, like, at least get the pronunciation right. Like, it's not that hard. Like, go to Google, say it a couple times before the video, get it right, bro. Like, if you're gonna prepare all this stuff, at least, get the pronunciation right. Your mama, what's this, bro?
Yeah,
And
but
then before we had,
yeah, that testify video is coming out soon. But yeah, I'm gonna what's it called? I'm gonna skip this part, and we're just gonna mention how they all came after the Prophet.
yeah,
Okay. Yeah, so there's a couple interesting points to bring here about him saying, "Oh, the Prophet ﷺ claimed prophethood in a climate where it was common." Well, first of all of them came after the time the Prophet claimed prophethood. That's the first thing. There's no records of people before that mentioning prophethood, and actually the Quran says this itself, saying no one before the Prophet came as a prophet to them. That's a source at the time of the Prophet ﷺ that claims this. And another point to bring up is the fact that we have a hadith where Abu Sufyan speaks to Heraclius, and Heraclius asks Abu Sufyan if anyone claimed prophet before him, and Abu Sufyan said no, and this is found in Bukhari. But one of the main points to bring up also is that notice how they all submit. They all either submit, they die from war, or they die from assassination. The Prophet ﷺ is an exception to this, and he prevailed like the Quran promised he would prevail. So this is actually a proof of prophethood, that people that were liars at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, they were claiming prophethood, they submitted and they failed in their mission, while the Prophet prevailed against all odds. That's actually a proof of prophethood.
yeah, exactly.
at the death of his son. These touches of humanity make his achievements all the more remarkable, not as supernatural miracles, but as the work of an extraordinary religious leader who unified disparate Arab tribes under a powerful monotheistic vision. The traditional narrative of Islam's spread, that it swept across Arabia primarily through divine miracle, is challenged by the historical record. The early Islamic community achieved dominance through a complex combination of factors.
Yeah, I mean, this is like a false dichotomy. Like, it's not one or the other. Like, it can be a miracle, and the miracle can happen through natural means. That doesn't mean like this dichotomy of, oh, it wasn't a miracle, it was like a complex reason of factors of all these different political and socioeconomic things. Yeah, that's true, but it was also a miracle because it's very unlikely, like one historian put it, for the Eskimos to beat Russia and America. It's very unlikely. It's possible due to some socio-economic factors that all of a sudden, that, and you have the one really good leader and the other side makes, a bunch of blunders, etc., etc. It's possible, but is it likely? You would still call that miraculous. So this is not very convincing.
And alliances, and a unifying religious message that resonated with existing monotheistic trends. Muhammad's genius lay in creating a movement that could transcend tribal divisions by placing all believers in direct relationship with one God, bound by shared ethical framework. This innovation proved extraordinarily effective in mobilizing Arab society for unprecedented expansion. Islamic tradition attributes various miracles to Muhammad: the splitting of the moon, multiplying food, healing the sick, the night journey, and most significantly, the miracle of the Quran itself. While these accounts are central to later Islamic piety, critical scholarship traces many to mythic and legendary antecedents. The famous story of Muhammad's night journey and ascension through the heavens has its roots in a genre of celestial journey literature, widespread across the ancient Near East. Earlier prophets and receiving instructions about prayer directly from God. This narrative emerged in elaborated form only in later hadith collections, not in the Quran itself, which makes only a brief, ambiguous reference in Quran 17:1. The story of Muhammad splitting the moon based on Quran 50.
That's not true, because Muqatil bin Sulaiman, he comes before Bukhari and these hadith collectors, and he mentions the Isra wal Mi'raj in his tafsir of chapter 17 verse 1. So that's wrong, actually.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, even if that wasn't the case, this dichotomy that Orientalists have, where they try and say that the hadith later embellish the account of Muhammad's life and they add these miracles, well, this is actually just a bias from the historical critical method, because they have to say that they did that. Otherwise, they can't explain the multiple sound reports that go back to the Prophet, where Ibn Hajar says there's over 50 reports that are sound in transmission that all relate the miracle of the splitting of the moon and tie it with chapter 54, right? So to throw all that out is completely unscientific. It's completely irrational. To say that it's a later embellishment and that there's this kind of dichotomy between the Quran and the Hadith is also kind of stupid, because what you're saying is
the Quran is not a bibliography of the Prophet. So we wouldn't expect it to have all the events of the Prophet's life in it. So if he does a miracle, it might mention it in passing, but that's not really the point of the Quran. The Quran is meant for all people in all times, and it's to do with, it's there to teach you a'mal, you know, stories of the prophets, give you moral lessons, etc., etc., give you your purpose, talk about the existential meaning of life. These are the main issues the Quran is there to answer for all times and all places. So whether or not the Prophet did a miracle, that's not really what it cares about, because it is the main miracle. Now, despite that, it still mentions the Prophet doing miracles, and they have to, you know, make crazy ta'wil of it. Like you said, the ayah with, you know, هذا سحر مبين, or every time they see a sign, they say this is magic or whatever. So again, this dichotomy doesn't really exist at all. This is again something that Orientalists have to read into the Quran and read out of Hadith through cherry picking. So this type of argument is very, very weak in my opinion, and it's very unsound, because it just literally, it relies on basically just cherry picking the different sources. That's all it is.
Yeah, and just quickly, just to explain how the Quran itself talks about the Prophet ﷺ doing miracles. You have in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, whenever they see a sign, they say it's pure magic, right? And there's three ways you can interpret a sign there, or ayah. Either ayah can be in the sense of a sign in creation of the alternation between day and night, or sun and moon, and this is a sign of God through natural occurrences. Or ayah can mean a verse of the Quran, or ayah can mean a miracle, such as one that you would reply to saying, this is pure magic, this is miraculous. The first interpretation of it meaning a sign as a natural sign doesn't make sense, because in the verse here, it says, the people that see this sign, they say it's magic. You're not going to call the sun and moon alternating magic. You're going to say, yeah, this is a sign of God through natural means, but not a miracle. The second point of it being a verse of the Quran, well, the verse says that they see a sign, not that they hear a sign. So that's not intuitive to be the case. And the third interpretation is the most likely, the most plausible, and this is the one that confirms our view that the Prophet did do miracles. And it's this idea that they saw a sign and they called it pure magic that they witnessed. And this is backed up from the fact that whenever Moses, peace be upon him, or Jesus, peace be upon him, did miracles from God, the people in their communities, in the Quran, it says that they would say that this is magic. Whenever they would deny the miracles sent to them, they would call it magic. This has obviously a parallel to the Prophet ﷺ in this instance, because obviously the person being addressed here that is doing this miracle in chapter 37 is the Prophet ﷺ, and this is clear from the context. And finally, we have Muqatil bin Sulaiman, someone's tafsir who comes decades before the hadith collections, 200 years after, and he mentions the fact that the term ayah here in this context means ayah in terms of a miracle, the miracle being the splitting of the moon. So we have an early attestation, early tafsir, the text itself of the Quran in its immediate context. The most intuitive interpretation is that a miracle is being spoken of here, and the fact that it parallels other accounts of other prophets in the Quran, where whenever they would do a miracle, the response would be similar, where they would say this is sihrun mubin. And finally, we have from what the Imam Malik, many miracles being mentioned, such as the multiplication of food, and this comes before Bukhari and Muslim. So it's even earlier than these hadith collections.
Of what religious audiences expected from divinely authorized figures. You see, long before the story of Muhammad splitting the moon, ancient cultures around the globe imagined dramatic lunar miracles involving damage, restoration, or divine intervention. Egyptian myths depicted Horus as symbolically tied to the moon as wounded.
Yeah, this guy's called Myth Vision, but he's just doing these conspiracy links. Like, if you watch this part, I'm not going to watch it, but he tries to link like some guy in
Chinese
China
to the Prophet, and says like there's a common tradition there, and he's linking like like the Mongols and this and that. Bro, like how are they reaching Arabia? Like how are the Egyptian like cultures reaching Arabia? The Egyptians are dead for how long before, you know, the Prophet is alive? He's probably
it's just fan fiction, bro, literally.
Yeah, like I said, historical fiction, bro.
And the ancient world's reverence for sacred texts. Greeks considered Homer divinely inspired. Jews saw Torah as God's perfect word. Various oracles and prophetic texts were believed to transcend human composition. The Quran's assertion of miraculous eloquence functioned within this established framework of textual reverence. What's striking is that the earliest...
Yeah, the Quran claims, like every time you see continuity, he's just going to bring it up as copying. So just there's a clashing of epistemologies here. Like, how are you going to look at it? A Muslim is going to look at the continuity of texts being revered as this is continuity from the fact that God revealed texts before and they were revered, and therefore the Quran is a continuation of that. He's going to look at that and say, no, these are borrowing traditions, and it just depends on what framework you're working by. And this is the whole point. The whole point of this whole video is, you have good reasons to believe in Islam. If you have good reasons to believe in Islam, then this video would not, like, imagine that 40 minutes of him compiling stuff. And wallahi, like, I don't, one thing that I see and I was like, damn, like, this is something that's gonna give me doubt.
Yeah. You have shubuhat din.
I mean, he had 40 minutes to give me. He had 40 minutes to give me one.
You don't have shubuhat now? Bro, I'm getting shubuhat.
Actually, the biggest shubahat I probably got is from his pronunciation. That gave me shubahat.
For me, the Chinese thing, I got shubuhat from it.
Now, what gave me the most shubahat is testifies pronunciation of Bagawi Tabari.
Bagawi Tabari. Sheikh testify.
That gave me super bro.
Anyway, on the serious note, right? So this guy basically he's trying to say like, look, these guys did this, therefore the Quran must have done this, and this is an assumption, bro. Like you have to understand when approaching a text, you have to approach it on its own merits, on its own epistemology, with its own tradition in mind. You can look at the surrounding tradition and see, okay, what was going on at the time. That's fair enough. But what you can't do is assume just because these people did something, a priori the same must be going on here. You need a justification for that, and there is no justification for that with the Quran. So just because Jews say like, oh, the Torah is the word of God, or therefore the Muslims got the same idea and copy pasted it. Well, how do you know that? You can't prove that. Or, you know, this book is sacred to this group of people, therefore that's why the Muslims decided to make up a sacred book. You can't prove that, bro. Like this is not something that can be historically deduced in any, like, with any degree of confidence or certainty. So for you to make that claim, it's a really strong claim that I don't think he knows like what he's saying. He just kind of just brings it all together. He just says, oh, I'm going to take a little bit of this tradition here, a little bit of that tradition there, some Chinese here, some Egyptian there, mix it all together, and you know, that's how we got Islam. And by the way, he's the top 10 biggest, you know, revisionist theories of all time. So it's very weak, bro. It's very weak.
Contain relatively few miracle stories at all. The Quran itself repeatedly states that Muhammad performed no miracles except the Quran, with verses like, they said, why are no signs sent down to him from his Lord? Say the signs are only with Allah, and I am only a clear warner. Quran 29:50. This suggests that miraculous tales proliferate later as the community sought to elevate their prophet to the supernatural status enjoyed by figures like Jesus in Christian tradition. Many miracle accounts entered the tradition during the period when Muslims were encountering Christians who boasted of Jesus' supernatural deeds. The impulse to show Muhammad as equally blessed with divine power likely motivated the collection and amplification of these stories in the 8th and 9th centuries, long after the events they purport to describe.
Yep.
So again, this idea that, first of all, the verse is talking about a specific incident. It's not talking about all of the life of the Prophet. So he's misunderstanding the verse in its context. So the Quran is not saying the Prophet did no miracles. It's simply quoting the believers as them saying, the critics of the Prophet, them saying, oh, why have we not seen a sign? Just because a particular group of believers didn't see a sign, that doesn't mean that the Prophet did no signs. This, again, is a jump in reasoning. And again, like I said before, this apparent discontinuity that he's trying to like make is you only see it if you don't read the rest of the Quran in context. And if you read the rest of the Quran and you understand it correctly, then you'll see that the Prophet is miraculous. For example, one of the miracles is one of the proofs of his prophethood is his khalq. Like Allah says, وَإِنَّكَ لَعَلَى خُلُقٍ عَظِيمٍ, that we have made you such a divine, you know, example, so that people can see your character, your akhlaq, and know just from your akhlaq that this is not the face of a person who lies. This is another miracle. That in of itself is miraculous. So you can't say like, oh, you know, there's no miracles in the Quran. No, it's just you don't want to see them. You don't want to see them. And then later with the hadith, you're trying to say, oh, this is in the 8th and 9th century. If you read the books of Motsky and Brown and you actually go deep into their works, they can reconstruct hadiths with miracle sayings from, and they can have common links up to the time of the Sahaba in the 7th century, like late 7th, mid 7th century. So for you to say, oh, this is all 8th century, 9th century embellishments, this is not true. This is completely untrue and anachronistic.
All right, guys, we'll end the video here, inshallah. If you guys want to check out Brother Leafy, I'm going to put his socials in the description, inshallah. Go subscribe to him and support his work. And if you want to support my work, then my GoFundMe and Patreon links will be down below. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.